Welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast, the photo imaging industry's leading news source. Here's your host, Gary Peugeot. The Dead Pixel Society podcast is brought to you by Media Clip, Advertech Printing, and Independent Photo Imagers.
Hello again and welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. I'm your host, Gary Peugeot, and today we're joined by, oh my gosh, Jerry Grossman, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Digital Imaging Reporter. Jerry and I have known each other since like day one of the
100 years, I think.
100 years, yes. Since the dawn of photography, glass plates, and all that. No, I'm just joking. Exactly. But no, Jerry and I have gone back many years. We want to talk a little bit about kind of how the industry's changed over the years. He's been working for manufacturers. He's been on the publication side, and now he's in higher education, actually. And he's going to be getting the International Photographic Council Distinguished Service Award next month. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But hi, Jerry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Gary. How are you doing? Always fun to talk.
Fabulous.
Good.
And it's always good to see old friends. It seems like there's fewer and fewer places to see old friends these days, with kind of the show thing going away and publications going away and things like that. So I remember you and I met back in Nikon days when you were at Nikon. How did you get started at Nikon? How did you start your career in the industry?
So it's a funny story. I think it's funny anyway. I was in the advertising business early on, working on Stanley tools and Crest toothpaste and all that. So I'm working on a Charmin toilet paper account, and I get a call from a headhunter that I didn't even know. Like, the phone rings, I pick it up. There's an opening on the Nikon camera account over at Scouting the Cave Slows, which was a great ad agency. I literally never met this guy, but it sounded like an amazing thing. So I'm thinking about it. I'm going, well, please don't squeeze a Charmin. We take the world's greatest pictures. What sounds better? And I think we take the world's greatest pictures sounds a lot better. So I ended up going on the interview. I got the job. It was for account supervisor on the Nikon account, and that's literally how I started my career in the industry. And I always tell people, including my students, I said, you never know when the phone rings who's going to be on the other end and how it's going to affect your life. If I was in the bathroom when that phone rang, I might have never been in this industry.
If you were like testing the Charmin product, for example.
For example, yes, that's a perfect example. That's how it started. And I was on the Nikon account for about a year and a half or so. And then the person who had the general manager communications job at Nikon was leaving. Mm-hmm. Steve Jarman. I don't know if you remember Steve years ago. Still a very good friend. And he recommended me for his spot. So then they hired me over there. And then that was sort of the beginning of my career in the photo industry.
So did you have any interest in photography other than being a snap shooter back then? Did you have any background at all?
You know what? Not really. I I guess you can call me a photo enthusiast, but I really wasn't. I think I had an SLR. I was very, I was always on the creative side. So I took a lot of pictures, but there was something about hearing Nikon. And then I ran out, bought a copy of Popular Photography magazine, saw this amazing spread for the NE008, if you remember that. Yeah. Shot by Michael O'Neill. And I said, you know what? This is what I want to do. This is so creative. And it was such a cool brand. Mm-hmm. Sure. And that I couldn't resist. So I took the job, and I stayed on the business side, but I learned so much about photography, obviously, by just being around it. It changed my life in a very positive way.
And you really, back then it was obviously film, and it was a different world, because you really had the SLR, not DSLR, just SLR 35 millimeter was really the epitome of photography back then. So there was a huge amount of interest, and autofocus was coming in pretty strong. It was kind of changing the game, because different manufacturers had different strategies of where they were going to put their autofocus, and that changed things up. It was kind of controversial back then, whether you put it in the lens or you put it in the body or wherever, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
What was that like in that? Because that was a pretty vibrant area, kind of high tech even.
It was crazy because A, there was no digital, and B, by the way, there was no internet.
Right.
Everything was changing. Autofocus was a huge deal. Exposure control was a huge deal. There was a real fight between Nikon and Canon, obviously, which I think continues today. It was an exciting time. It was, digital was just coming around. That was like in the mid to late 90s. And I remember sitting in meetings when it first started, where we see these digital images, and my old friend Richard Lapinto, who I'm
Right.
sure you remember as well, would say, "Yeah, it's digital, but it'll never be the same thing as film." And then
Well,
and then
'cause everyone thought that, right?
yeah, and then like 6 months later, it's like, oh, these images are pretty good, but it'll never be filmed, but it's pretty good. And then there was this arc,
Yeah.
right? And then it was like about the same, and then just digital kept getting better and better and better. It was a crazy time because we were selling film cameras. Obviously, we were selling digital cameras or trying to get into that. We were selling point and shoot digital cameras. We were watching technology change in front of our eyes. It was exhilarating.
And then one of the things that was interesting was, Nikon back then, actually, when it came to compact cameras and early digital, were pretty innovative. I mean, they were trying, rotating lenses and all kinds of interesting designs, which were very different from what the other compact companies were doing. What was that like? I mean, because obviously you're getting this stuff from Japan, what was the design ideas like back then? What was driving that?
If you remember, and I'm sure you do, it started to be all about the megapixels at first, right?
Right.
We had our Coolpix cameras, and everyone was sort of competing on that side of it, right? It was who can make the better point and shoot. And we had I forget what it was called, the Coolpix something that had a pen you could draw on. It was really early on. I forget the name of it. It was the megapixel wars, right? It was every year. It was like, well, now 2 megapixels, 3 megapixels. There was also this fight, as I'm thinking about it, of do we include the 8 megabyte compact flash card in the camera, right? Because if we do, we have to charge a little more. If we don't, then when the kids get their Coolpix camera on Christmas Day, they can't take a picture, right? So like, what do we do? So that was a fight that sort of, evolved over into, let's not include it anymore. I think once it reached like 60 megabytes, it got too big or something like that. So it was, all that stuff was happening. It was, again, another exhilarating time because sales were going crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Every year, every company was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Oh, yeah. Plus you had, all kinds of brands that were getting, being introduced to the market, or they were being reinvigorated, where they just, digital camera companies were just popping up out of nowhere.
Exactly. And the major brands were sort of controlling the market.
Oh, sure.
In a pretty good way, but it was a crazy time. And by the way, at the same time, so I was the general manager of communications, and there was this thing called the internet sort of starting to happen, right? And my boss came to me, he said, "Jerry, you are now the vice president of internet development." And I was like, "Okay, what does that mean?" And he said, you need to get a website up in about the next 6 months. I was like, all right, what's a website? Because no one knew what that was.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
What's a website?
Everyone wanted one, but no one knew what it was. And our challenge, interestingly, was Nikon was a consumer brand and also a medical device brand. We made microscopes and instruments. And for the first time, we were charged with combining the brand into one internet site because we couldn't do one without the other. So from a branding standpoint, that was sort of fun and interesting and cool. And
again, you're not using any of the modern technology that we're all used to, right? Everyone was inventing that stuff as it was happening, right? So the whole idea of having, different pages for different divisions and how that was going to look, and that must have been almost a nightmare.
Totally different. And also the people that you were working with, whoever knew the coolest words were the people you thought were the smartest people in the room, right? Internet this, internet that. But I have to tell you, I spent a lot of time in San Francisco. It was really, as I think about my career looking back, it was one of the most, the coolest time because all this technology was happening both on the product side, on the internet side, and no one knew what was coming next.
Yeah, and that was
fantastic.
It's funny because when you talk about things like that to, to people today who didn't grow up in that area, right? And, there wasn't the belief necessarily that film was going to get replaced, right? Because no one could really see the future, and certainly no one expected smartphones and things like it. Maybe somebody did, right? But not in the photographic industry, which at the time was considered pretty high tech, right?
Yeah.
And the belief never was, at first, that people were going to change their behavior as radically as they did. I think that was the thing that surprised most people, was just the volume of pictures just exploded that people were taking.
Exactly. Well, yeah, because all all of a sudden, when you took a picture, you didn't take one, you took three or four or five,
Right.
because you weren't paying for film anymore. Right. The photographic behavior changed.
Right.
Right. People all of a sudden thought, well, the other part of it was, well, I don't really need an SLR anymore because I got this sort of point and shoot digital camera that, that's taking pretty good pictures now. So that changed. And then I think the most shocking, and it happened years later, if someone had said to you, Kodak's going to go out of business, you'd be like, no, they're not.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But they kind of missed the boat by sort of hanging on to film for a long time because they had to.
Right.
There was so many things happening. And like you just said before, the smartphone is creeping up, right? It's taking pretty good pictures. And yeah, but people are always going to want cameras. Yeah, but it's taking better and better. And I remember, Gary, being at a conference with you, and you may have even been on stage with me, I'm not sure. And one of the camera companies, and maybe it was Nokia, I don't know, said in 5 years, we're going to be able to take 12 megapixel pictures on a phone. And we're like, no, you're not.
Who was that, right?
Right. That's never going to happen. And,
well, never say never, right?
Exactly. So
there were just assumptions that people made back then. I mean, you mentioned Kodak, and I don't want to, turn this into a, what went wrong with Kodak, because I've done that podcast a couple times, and it's go back and listen to those, listener. But the thing is people really didn't. The misconception there was, Kodak was a chemicals company. They were not a consumer electronics company. They were trying to leave from being a chemicals company to being a consumer electronics company, and that just the margins were different. It's a different business. And I don't think anyone expected, especially the folks at Kodak, that people weren't going to print as much. I really thought they kind of thought, well, people are still going to want that physical print. They're going to print more. And no matter how, they tried, I don't know how many different things to make it easier to print pictures, right? The kiosks became super easy. They had buttons on the camera, one, button print. And it just the demand wasn't there. People, once they saw the picture, didn't need to print everything. So the printing business has changed a lot. It's become more of a creative expression instead of I need to have that picture.
Yeah, no, that's true. But we were literally changing consumers' behavior in photography in so many different ways.
Sure.
Right. Going from film to digital, going from point and shoot cameras, to smartphones, trying to keep DSLRs relevant at the same time.
Yeah, sure.
The technology just kept coming and coming. What's amazing about this industry is, all the major manufacturers and, way many more companies than that continue to push the envelope on technology in so many different ways.
Sure.
And to me, that always impressed me like crazy. That kept the industry going when, if you think about it, when the point and shoot digital market crashed, it isn't like the industry crashed. The industry got a lot smaller. Sales got smaller, but the industry and the manufacturers and the technology just kept getting better and better.
Yeah.
So
that is a way of looking at it. Sure, the $100 point and shoot market's kind of gone because it's all in the phone, but you've got Fuji, Canon, Nikon, Leica, all these people having these really, wonderful compact cameras. It's not even getting to mirrorless or DSLRs, but it's just these compact rangefinder type cameras, or even Nikon just came out with a super zoom. That they're addressing the market with products that cost a lot more, but they can demonstrate that they're worth it.
Right. Here's what's interesting. I'm teaching a class of 20-year-olds in public relations, and I talk to them all the time because I want to hear what's going on. And there's been this trend lately of those kids, the Gen Zers, if you will, buying point and shoot digital cameras again and wanting to use them. And I asked my class, I said, what is it about that? They said, this is great. They said, when you're using an iPhone, the pictures are too good. They're too perfect.
Right.
I swear to God. It's like we want to, take pictures that aren't perfect, that maybe show a different kind of mood. So maybe there's a little bit of a comeback there, but I thought that was
well, they want that authenticity, right? And that's driving the whole reemergence of film that we're seeing, right? That
exactly.
You're getting those imperfect pictures, or slightly out of focus, or they're even like distressing the negs, and they're all these people selling outdated film because they want it to look weird, and and it's funny because I'm from the world where we tried to get away from all that. It's like you want to make the picture on the film as perfect as possible in the camera, get the great exposure, get the thing you want in focus, and all the other stuff. And now it's like, well, we want it to be a little imperfect.
Right. You really have to, as a marketing person, you really have to listen to the new generation. You can't just keep doing what you're doing. And I think that's the perfect lesson of they're looking at what we threw in the garbage. They're looking at film, they're looking at point and shoot cameras, and they're saying, you know what, there's something going on here. So, you know what, if it continues to drive the interest in photography, which I think we haven't really mentioned, but I think that phones absolutely did that. People that never took pictures before are now taking pictures every minute of every day.
Yeah.
It's been a crazy industry. I mean, as we're talking and where we're living it, it's been a crazy, 25, 30 years. It really has.
And really photography, whatever your description of that is, right? Whether it's, smartphones, mirrorless cameras, action cameras, we haven't even talked about, all the different kinds of cameras there are now, right? It's really more popular than ever. It's just, we don't have the camera companies aren't really leading the charge in a lot of ways on that, right? And so, it'll be interesting to see why or what happens. Can they make a mirrorless camera, be more like a phone? Like I've always been surprised why, for example, Canon or Nikon doesn't come up with a camera body that you can put a cell phone camera in it, right? So it basically, so you can wirelessly transmit directly from the camera. And who knows? I mean, I'm sure there's probably a technical reason why they can't, but it's just one of those things where I think, there's a lot of innovation happening, but it's not just coming from the big three or the big
exactly. Two. Yeah, because they're advanced digital technical companies that can contribute all different kinds of thinking that maybe the camera companies, never had to do. Obviously, now that they're doing it more and more. I mean, if you think about it, the engineers in the camera companies are brilliant.
Right.
I mean, the things that they did over the years, just in inventing different technologies. I remember when red eye reduction was invented. My friend Iran Steinberg, remember Iran?
Yeah.
Great guy. He was kind of the guy that put that on the map when, like, oh wow, you take a picture and there's no red eye anymore. Yeah. That was back in the 35 millimeter point shoot days.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But there's, like I said, there's always been technology like coming. And I'm impressed and proud of all those companies that didn't give up and said, no, we're going to make things better.
Right.
And they continue to do it. I think
absolutely.
It's fantastic.
I mean, honestly, if you look at some of the bigger companies, as cameras have become lesser part of their business, right? Because, Canon's a copier company and Nikon's a medical instruments company and Sony's an entertainment company, right? And but they're still in the business and they're still innovating, right? They're still doing some amazing things with the products beyond what, most of us could recommend or remember that, with terms of like what you can shoot with ISOs now. I mean, I remember when like 800 ISO was pushing it, right?
Yeah, right. Now that's like a tiny number.
I know.
Yeah.
Now.
Right. All those companies, the cream always rises to the top, and all those companies have just, especially Sony has been very impressive. I mean, they kind of, started mirrorless. They said, we're going to be mirrorless. We're going to do mirrorless. And like you just said, they were an entertainment company. Yeah. But decided to put, all the camera eggs in that basket, and
it's paid off.
It's really paid off for them. Yeah, it's been very impressive.
So let's get back to kind of your career evolution, because you're with this great company called Nikon, right? And it was doing wonderful things. And then you said, I want to take a risk and I want to do something else. So what was that like when you took over Rudy and Ed's publication? First, you got to say who that is and what that was and how that came about.
Exactly. Rudy Mask and Ed Wagner were two guys in the publishing industry that have been there for 1,000 years. They were owned PTN. They had a lot of different magazines. I was in Nikon. There was a change of management. There was and my dad had always said to me, he was he had his own business. He said, you have to have your own business one day because that's really changed your life. So all that's happening. I call up Ed Wagner. I'll never forget it. I said, Ed, he had sold PTN and started Photo Industry Reporter in 1993 with Rudy. And it wasn't a good looking magazine, but he was out there trying to make a buck and all that.
Yeah.
So I called him up. I said, Ed, if you ever want to sell your magazine, let me know because I might be interested. He said, and I quote, he said, Jerry, I'm 85 years old. He goes, let's have lunch this week. I said, okay. So had lunch. Um, I had, I was pretty confident that I could run a magazine from the edit side. I'd been the editor of Nikon World magazine when I was at Nikon. So I kind of got it. I needed a person to sell advertising. And I had a friend, Al Levine, was working at Golf Digest at the time. And I called him. I said, Al, I have this sort of idea about buying this magazine. Let's talk about it. He came over, he looked at the magazine and said, what, are you kidding me? I said, no.
It was not pretty.
It was not pretty. It was, and I said, but we could do something here. And he said, all right, let's do it. We pooled our money. We bought the magazine in 2005 as Photo Industry Reporter. We ended up changing it to Digital Imaging Reporter, and I think around 2009 or 2010. And we turned it, Ed's magazine was black and white on crappy paper. We turned it into a, kind of a good looking magazine. It was exciting. And I have to tell you that the thing that sort of I still think about is the support. When I left Nikon after 12 or 13 years, I was always the Nikon guy, but the support that I got from the whole industry, from my former enemies, now friends at Canon,
absolutely.
And Sony and Pentax and Ricoh, and all those guys sort of said, you know what, we're going to help this guy out. And I'll never forget it. I'm always grateful for it. But it started kind of a new career of being in the publishing business. There weren't a lot of trade magazines left. And
hey, now we were there.
Oh, I'm sorry. PMA Magazine was absolutely there. One of our foremost competitors.
That's right. Well, we almost merged at one point. That's like an untold story. I don't know if we can get into that one, but we almost merged our publications at one point.
That's true. We did talk about that a little bit.
And then, of course, there was Picture Business that was out there.
Picture Business with Doris Burke, was it? Was that? Who was
Mike
Picture
McEnany
Business?
was running that.
Oh, that's right. Mike was doing that. They were right. They was right.
But you're right. There wasn't a lot, right? There wasn't a lot.
There used to be a ton.
Photographic processing and all. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Ed and Rudy used to invent magazines every other week, and there was a lot of advertising dollars. It was all good. And our kind of real promise was the PMA show, right? We were going to do the dailies. We were going to do that. Really great revenue. Great time. And then, things went well. I mean, we held on for about 20 years, which I'm very proud of. And I owe a lot to the industry for always supporting us, always appreciating us, but because we ended up being pretty much the only game in town at the end. Look, the industry got smaller, the dealer base got smaller. Yeah. But there was always a need, I thought, for a publication that supported the dealers, that talked about the business. That was our focus. And that's what we always tried to do. We tried to be honest with everyone. And, I'm kind of proud that it all happened. It was a cool time.
Yeah. I mean, it was, guys were a solid competitor. And, that was always one of the things where, the world was big enough, at least the PMA world, where, you could come in and do your daily. And I think somebody else tried a daily once or twice. And, and there was plenty to go around. I mean, our show issues were monsters because of the amount of advertising back then. And, just the world changed, I mean, that was just the reality of, the show got smaller, the dealer base started getting smaller. There was the stuff it took to process pictures that, took up a bunch of advertising in our books was, all the gadgets you needed to process film, all the film processor, film leaders and all that kind of stuff all went away. And, just there wasn't the base there.
Right. It was harder and harder after a while to find the advertisers. But I do have to commend while I'm in this world, the photo dealers.
Oh yeah, because, absolutely.
They're like the best people. They're the most committed. They saw their businesses start to dwindle when the phones came out and all that. But they were always committed to photography. And, a lot of them obviously went out of business. A lot of them, people aged out who, own businesses. But as I understand it now, and as I hear now, people are, photo dealers are starting to grow again. People are starting to open new businesses. And I think that's fantastic. But I appreciate it. And I really love the people in the industry.
That's what keeps me in it, honestly, is, I love I love going to the pro convention and IPI.
Pro is fantastic.
And it's just, they're just people who care about their business. They care about their communities. They're running smart businesses. They're making great decisions. And, when you really go to a pro conference, you just see the best of the best who are
so creative.
Yeah, exactly.
In what they do, and so unique, and just it's a quote unquote small business, but it takes so much to run something like that, and there are so many success stories and so many stories of families, generation, third generation that continue to be committed to the business. So I have to take my hat off to them. It's
I know I couldn't do it. I don't think I could run a camera store. And I think it would be, just what it takes to do something like that in terms of knowing how to buy, when to buy, negotiate terms, deal with rebates, all those crazy things because the camera industry is really kind of, the hardware business is super hard because there's not much margin there. So you've got to really know what you're doing. And those guys definitely do. And women. There's obviously female dealers. When I say guys, it's a generic thing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, no, they are really proud of them. So,
but then as part of that evolution in your career, you also were involved with the Industry Association for the Manufacturers, the PMDA. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved with PMDA?
Absolutely. When I bought the magazine, I thought, all right, it's time to be on the board. I was offered a spot on the board when I was in Nikon, but I wasn't ready for it. I didn't think. But when I had my business, I was like, here's a place to sort of meet all the people that used to not be my competitors, et cetera, et cetera. I ended up being the executive director, and we did some great stuff. One thing we did was we invented a program called Portraits of Love.
Yep.
Where we asked photographers to take pictures of military families, and then we sent those images to soldiers all around the world. And me and Michelle Tramontano, who was working with me as well, kind of built that up as a big give back program.
Yeah, that was a great program.
It really was. It made us feel great. And kudos to Fuji for helping us out on that. And then we also did the PMDA awards dinner every year where we did a photographer of the year and an industry leader of the year and all that, and had our big parties in Vegas and all that. But the cool thing about PMDA as well is, those were opportunities to get people together in the industry to talk to each other. Right. And it's so valuable. And so after that happened, PMA kind of went away, unfortunately. PMDA sort of was suffering a little bit. So we started the Imaging Alliance, which the thought on that was, why should we have a manufacturers trade association and a retailer dealers trade association? Why don't we put it together?
Right.
So we started the Imaging Alliance, invited both dealers and manufacturers to it. And, it was just a great opportunity to once every 2 months sit around a table, talk about the industry, talk about give back programs, which we did a few of them. And, I kept that going. I was executive director. That we probably kept that going about 4 or 5 years, and then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And it got harder to keep it going. But that whole notion of trade associations that get people together. PMDA used to have, back in the early 2000s, maybe the 90s, a cocktail party every month.
Right.
In New York City. Get together, have a few drinks, have a dinner.
Yeah, I used to come in for those almost every month. I'd be PMA guy going to the PMDA meeting almost every month.
Yeah, and they were great. And that, that whole notion of, especially after COVID, where people figured out that they could do a Zoom, that they don't have to get together, that they don't have to see each other. The ability to get into a room, put the whole industry together, just to talk, just to be friends, just to talk about the challenges. I was a big believer in that. So my whole PMDA Imaging Alliance run was really, really a great way for me to give back. Anyway, so that was a very fulfilling part of my my career, which I kind of miss now. Like you're out there doing it still. I'm not doing it as much, and I miss seeing the people. I miss just
that's
keeping the friendships going.
Because it is how people do business. That's the reason why when you go to these conferences, Pro, IPI, etc. Hans Hartman Sing Visual First is another one, right? The people always say the value of those events is, in addition to the content, is mostly the networking interaction. So
any contact.
Yep.
No, it's been a long time anyway.
But it is a people business. That's what I kind of miss about the industry is, even though we had these enormous companies, right? Nikon, Olympus, Fuji, Canon, Sony, Kodak. they always had great people in them, right? You could go to an event or a conference, a PMDA Hall of Fame Awards night dinner, and you could just see people all over the world who every other night of the year, every other day of the year, they're doing battle in the marketplace, right? But
Right.
at that event, they're just, they put the swords down and they're all got their arms around each other.
They're all in the same boat, and they all respected each other. They all respected, how hard it was to run these businesses, and how much time you spent away from your families, and traveling to Japan and traveling to all these trade shows, and like you said, everyone liked each other. Everyone, not everyone, but pretty much.
There's always that one guy at that company, right? We won't mention that one.
Exactly, we won't go there. But yeah, it was. I've always said it was such a great industry to grow up in, and to sort of be part of what my career was. And from that one phone call from the guy I didn't even know to all these years of just being able to be a part of not just a great business, but we haven't really spoken about this, the creativity in this business. The creativity of photography by itself. The fact that everyone got to work with all these great photographers, and whether they're portrait or landscape or travel, whatever, everyone in the industry was creative in their own right. And there aren't a lot of industries. If you're an accountant, that's not happening, right? But if you're in the imaging industry, it's happening all around you. And I think that's what really kept people in the industry for a long time.
Yeah. Well, it drew a lot of creative people just because if you wanted to be visual, that was the way to do it. Now, it's kind of spread out everywhere. Now, with AI, you don't even have to get out in the field to make a picture, right? You could just.
Yeah. Isn't that scary? I mean, I
don't know. I don't know.
It's interesting.
I kind of look back on it as, kind of the fear people had when Photoshop came in, and it didn't kill the industry. So, I could be super naive, but I think it was, as going back to our conversation earlier, maybe it'll be authentic pictures are going to be even more meaningful now because of AI, things like that.
Yeah. And you know what? I don't think people in the industry ever want to lose the creativity of it. And if you could be creative using AI as well, which is kind of interesting. But I think the whole nature of photography, I think that's going to always be around. I think people will always enjoy taking pictures. I think people always enjoy capturing the moment when things happen. And you see it all the time. You're out to dinner and it's like, let's take a picture of the four of us around a dinner table. You never did that before.
Right.
And that's going to always happen.
Yeah.
So,
well, but then the question is, it gets to the business side, right? How does the everyday person make a couple bucks out of that picture, right? And that's always going to be a challenge going forward.
Well, that's true too. So
let's talk a little bit about the IPC luncheon. Can you give us the details on that, and where can people go to find out more about it and see you get your award?
Absolutely. So, oh God, I should have the date. I think it's May 14th.
It is indeed.
It is May 14th. It's become sort of the annual trade luncheon, if you will. It's a great organization. They promote photography all around the world. It's happening at the United Nations. I am lucky enough to be the recipient of the Distinguished Service Award for my XXX number of years in the industry. And I won't say what it is, but because it's scary. But it should be really good.
There's numerous other people being given awards too. I mean, there's Joe McNally, a lot of name photographers and luminaries will be there as well.
Exactly. It's not, you're right. I'm not the only draw, is what you're saying. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that.
You alone are sufficient, I'm sure, but there are.
Yeah, right. If you go to www.ipcphoto.org, you can get your tickets. It's a really nice event. And like I said, it's one of the kind of last bastions of trade association get together where people could just talk about things, really appreciate what photography is all about. But it's a fantastic organization. I have to thank Kathy Schneider Jello, who was probably one of the first people to call me when I got to Scouting the Cape Slopes years ago. She was running advertising for Peterson's Photographic, if you remember that. Yep. And she, even though she's moved out to Florida and she's selling high-end cars, she still every year puts this program together and does an amazing job. So I thank her for it. And if people want to come and hang out and have a nice lunch, and it'd be great to see everyone there.
Well, great, Jerry. It's been great talking to you and reconnecting and reminiscing. Hope to see you at May 14th at the United Nations. Congratulations on your award. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gary. And you know what? Thank you for, I'm sure people say this every once in a while, but thank you for all you've done in the industry. You're the guy that has kept the light on for a long time. And I know you have a lot more years left, and anything that I can do to help you, please let me know. And I really appreciate this too. This was a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun reminiscing with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jerry. Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. Read more great stories and sign up for the newsletter at www.thedeadpixelssociety.com.